Well, sorry about that, everybody.
There you go.
Little technical hitch, probably my fault. I'm not overly good at these things. But so thanks for coming out. If you don't know me, I am Joseph A. McCullough. I am a writer and game designer, originally from North Carolina, but currently living in Kent in England. And so we're currently famous for, a new version of the virus. Yeah, go us. The poll has just popped up in front of my screen again, but I'm just going to carry on. Just be aware that I probably won't be able to see the chat very well because it's half blocked. But if you guys, oh, there it goes again. All right. So anyway, I am here today to talk about my game, Rangers of Shadow Deep. There we go. And I'm going to start off by giving a little history of what it is and where it came from. So Rangers of Shadow Deep, I call it a tabletop adventure game, but it was my attempt to see if I could push traditional tabletop wargaming in the direction of role-playing farther than it had ever been pushed before. To give me some of that role-play experience, but using a much more miniatures-heavy kind of system. And to give the background, so in 2015, I put out my first game, my first tabletop war game called Frostgrave. And it became a bit of a hit. And so I sort of slowly became a professional game designer. And a couple of years after Frostgrave came out, I had this idea of wanting to do a more role-playing-esque war game. And so I started to think about what that would mean. And the first thing I realized that it meant, to me anyway, was that the game needed to be cooperative. One of the keys to role-playing for me has always been that you are the group adventuring, fighting against the whatever, the evil. And that's not something that I had really seen before in tabletop wargaming. Traditionally it's player versus player. So I wanted to see, can I do this cooperatively? And at the same time, I realized, actually, if I'm coming up with mechanics to play cooperatively, I can just as easily do mechanics to play solo, because from a game design point of view, they're very similar things. They're both going to be the player or players versus the game. So I can do one, I can do the other. And thankfully, I had a basis to start out this. I had Frostgrave, so I had a set of rules that I knew worked for combat, for moving figures on a table. And that game also even had random monsters. So I already had some rules for how monsters would move on a table. But I started to think, how can I take that next step and really make it challenging for the players to play against a game? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of talk you through the book a little bit about how my thought process, because my thought process kind of went in the order of the book, and how I landed at the game that I got. So just to show you again, so this is the current version of the book. There are a couple of editions of it floating around, and I'll explain at the end what those all are, so that if you do want to go buy the book or buy the game, you can get the one you want. But to start off, so the first thing you do when you open the book and start going through is you design a ranger. And by ranger, I don't necessarily mean ranger in the classic Aragorn sense. Within the game, the rangers are a group. So I should probably give the backstory for the game. In a nutshell, there's this kingdom of Alador, of which you are a part. And it used to be next to this kingdom called Larenthia. But then one day, Larenthia literally collapsed. It just fell and was covered in shadow. Just the shadow rolled over it, and it's this place called the Shadow Deep. And essentially the Shadow Deep goes around eating kingdoms. And no one really understands how this works or what's controlling the Shadow Deep or anything like that. But if you got the Shadow Deep on your border, eventually it's going to eat you. So in the game, the Shadow Deep, as a giant idea, is the enemy, and you as the player are the rangers. You are the king's elite troops, essentially, that get sent out on special missions. And you can be a ranger in the classic Aragorn mold, or you can be a shining knight, or you can be a wizard, or you can be a thief, or whatever, but you're all called rangers for the purpose of the game. And the first thing you do in the game is you create that ranger. And like I said, that really is just a title, not a class. The game doesn't have classes as such. What it does have is a system very much like building a role-playing character. So if I can go to the back of the book, you'll see this is how I always check a role-playing game, by the way, when I pick one up on the shelf, is I immediately flip to the character sheet, see what the character sheet looks like. And as you can maybe sort of see here, you've got a character sheet in the back. So you got your stats running at the top and your skills down the side and your special heroic abilities. And what you do is you have 10 build points, essentially, and you can spend those build points increasing your stats, buying skills, buying heroic abilities or spells, or increasing your recruitment, which is kind of the number of companions you can get for your missions. The skills are pretty straightforward. I mean, the stats are pretty straightforward. That's your fighting and your shooting and your move. And your skills also are things can be like picking locks or swimming or reading runes, that kind of thing. So you're kind of your traditional role-playing type skills. The one difference between kind of role-playing games and this was you got heroic abilities and spells, but these are all things you will be able to use once during a scenario. So in spells, that's kind of actually traditional kind of D&D style. You know, I've learned this spell and I can use it. But it also applies to your heroic abilities, which can be things like parry or sprint, which allows you to make an extra long move, or hand of fate, which allows you to re-roll a die. And this is what brings a lot of the tactical nuance to the game as you play it, because you're going to be deciding what is the crucial moment in this scenario to use my heroic ability. You know, these are my cheat cards, essentially, that I have a limited number of. And is it better to use it now, or should I wait for later in the scenario? So there's a big list of those that you can choose from. But like I said, for each one of those you choose, you're potentially costing yourself skill points or better stats or something like that. But you have a lot of options here. So like I said, if you want to create a wizard, you could create someone who has no heroic abilities but all spells. If you want to create a knight, you can give them nothing but heroic abilities to focus on combat. If you want to create the thief type, you can have heroic abilities that give you kind of skill bonuses or automatic successes when you're doing that. So a lot of options there and a lot of things to play with. And if you're playing solo, obviously you create one ranger. If you're playing cooperatively, which you can do with up to 4 players, you each create one. And like with a role-playing game, a balanced party is probably your better move. But it's up to you. So after you've gone through that process and created all that, the next thing you're going to do is kind of recruit your companions. So as I mentioned, one of the things you can do with your build points is get more recruitment points. Every ranger has a number of recruitment points, and they can use these to spend to get other kind of NPCs, if you will, in their party. So, you know, you can recruit a thief or a big warrior or even a magic user, none of which will be as powerful as your main character as your ranger, but will be there to help you out during the game. And the way the game is balanced, if you're playing cooperatively versus solo, so if you're playing with one player, then your ranger will start with 100 recruitment points to get anywhere between 0 and 7 companions. If you're playing with 2 rangers, each ranger is going to start with 40 recruitment points to recruit a maximum of 3 companions, and so on. So that by the time you're playing with 4 rangers, they can each only have 1 companion worth X number of points. And this is to bring that balance. So typically, a party is going to have about 8 people in it, independent of the fact of whether those are rangers, whether they're kind of PC characters, or whether it's 1 ranger and 7 NPCs. So if you're playing with 1 ranger, you're going to have probably better quality companions to help you out on the trek, because the companions in general aren't as good as the rangers. So you've done that. You've gotten your ranger together. I didn't go into all the things with the ranger. You do have to choose equipment and equip your ranger and things like that. But and then you've got your companions, and then after a quick look at the rules, you're ready to go. So unlike most tabletop war games, this game is completely scenario driven. So basically you have to have a scenario. And in the book, there's 17 of these divided into different missions. And so the first mission, you basically are you're investigating a deserted town where another ranger has gone and been lost, and you're trying to find him. So that's the first scenario, and then the second scenario leads on from that. And I'm going to kind of quickly walk through that just so you can see a bit how the game plays. So the scenario says, set up the table like this. It's get a 2x2 table, place a well in the center, and place all of your figures around that well. Now place 6 buildings in kind of a circle around the well, about 12 inches away. And then scatter a bunch of other terrain, some nice trees or some wagons or something, just to give the whole thing a nice, aesthetic look to it. I mean, I try not to over talk about how a scenario looks. I mainly just give you this scenario needs 6 buildings. It doesn't even need to be buildings anyway. It could be 6 ruins, as long as it's kind of the 6 key locations. And how the game works is basically there are going to be a number of clue markers scattered around that table, in this case. And since your mission is to find this missing ranger, you need to investigate these clue markers and see what they tell you. So as the game progresses, you can move your figures around and get to the clue markers and investigate them, and you'll roll on a clue marker table, and that'll tell you what you have found. And that may be as straightforward as, you found a purse full of gold. Or it could be more complicated and say, you need to make a perception roll. And so then you take your perception skill and you roll it, and it'll tell you what you found if you succeeded on the roll. Now, of course, it's not so simple as just walking around and looking at clue markers, because the game also starts with several zombies on the table, and these zombies start converging on you. And more importantly, at the end of every turn, you draw a card. And this is just a regular deck of cards that you've kind of assembled before the game, because there's also an event table. And every card you draw has an entry on that event table. So something happens at the end of each turn. And this could be more zombies show up, or a zombie pops out of one of the buildings that you weren't expecting it to, or there's a sudden downfall of rain, so now it's really hard to shoot and see things happening. And because these events occur in a random order each time you play the game, no 2 games are going to be the same. So you never know, you might have a game where actually the first couple of turns aren't too bad. All we got were some rain and some weird mist or something. Or you could have a game where in the first 2 turns, most of the zombies all showed up right at the beginning, so you're immediately wading in there and fighting. So hopefully you complete this mission, and in that mission you discover some clues about what's going on, and that leads directly into the second mission, where you have to go into a forest and potentially fight things that actually caused the zombies to form. And that's kind of your starter scenario, just the starter mission, these 2 scenarios. And from there, you can go on to the other missions. So that's just kind of that starts as soon as kind of the Shadow Deep has come and the Rangers are still trying to figure out, what's going on? And the second mission is more about going to the edge of the Shadow Deep, journeying and trying to literally see what's going on. And then you actually go down into the Shadow Deep and you start exploring in there. And this is the point I had the book when I'd first written it. I had all the rules, and I had these 3 missions that you could do. And I showed it to a few friends of mine, and most of them came back, hey, this is great, we love it, which is, of course, as the creator, exactly what you want to hear, except for my friend Ash Barker, who you may have seen if you've ever watched Guerrilla Miniatures Games, great YouTube channel. He came back to me and said, this is great, you're almost there. And he said, why don't you just do a little more with it? And I was like, what? My game's perfect. How could he dare say that? But actually, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, gosh, he's right. I want to take this even one more step towards role-playing. And the way I did that was I created what became the first expansion for the game, called Burning Light. And I thought this expansion shows off so much the potential of the game. It really needs to be part of the game. So it's actually included in the book. And what it is one mission that has 9 scenarios in it. And what makes it really different from a lot of war games, especially, is I don't know if you can see this. Let's see if you can. But basically, you're exploring this convent, and this is just a rough map of the convent. And each one of those rooms represents a different scenario. But you, as the player, can decide what order to investigate this convent. And you're looking for one specific thing. And in this one, not only are you moving around doing the different scenarios in the order you want, but you're uncovering clues that, unlike the earlier scenarios, are listed in notes. So it's more like a kind of choose your own adventure. You may go and uncover a clue and it'll say, roll your perception to see if you see X. And if you succeed at that, you'll go read note 532. And it'll give you a clue on where this artifact you are seeking might be. So not only do you have this kind of real sense of you as the player don't know everything going into the game, but you've also got the puzzle element of can you actually figure out from the clues you find where this is. And also it becomes a much harder mission in that you can't replace your people as you play through the game. So if you lose companions, they're gone for the mission. And so you really, unlike a lot of war games where you're just like, go, kill, you need to conserve your resources and really make sure that you're protecting your people as you go through, because you're going to need them. It's not to say that you might not come across some help during the game. That may happen too, but yeah, you got to be careful with it. So that kind of started me down a road of different ways mechanically to push the game. And so I'll talk about that in a minute and some of the supplements and stuff. But that's your basic game. It's, like I said, solo or cooperative. And while the Burning Light scenario I just talked about does have kind of hidden information, so you may not want to play through that twice, all of the games do feature this kind of random event table so that every scenario will play out differently every time you play it, and obviously to play differently with different rangers and such. So that's the game in a brief nutshell. I do want to talk a little bit about the editions. So when it first came out, I actually self-published it through Drive-Thru RPG. And this is that. And actually it did so much better than I expected that I realized I needed to, well, I didn't need to do anything, but it did so well that actually Modiphius, an RPG company here in the UK that you may be aware of, does Star Trek and stuff, approached me and asked if they could print the game. And I actually went back and forth on this a lot because I was having a lot of fun self-publishing, but I'm a real bibliophile, and they convinced me that they could do a really nice edition of the book, and they were right. So the first edition they did was actually this Green Book edition, which is called the Deluxe Edition. And at the time, what it did was not only redesign my self-published edition, but it also incorporated some new character building elements I had put out in a later expansion, so some new heroic abilities and new spells, and really became the definitive edition of the game. If you're in the US, you might still be able to find this. It's actually out of print, but there are still a few floating around. If you can't find it, then this edition has just been printed in the UK and should be landing in the US any day now. Internally, there is almost no difference between these two editions. This one actually has an event table that's wrong. So Mission 2, Scenario 2 has a wrong event table. You can, if you have this copy of the book, you can get the correct one for free in the Rangers Rules Update. But otherwise, this is exactly the same interior, except fixing a little, a couple of typos here and there. So either one of those you can get will do you for the game. If you're just a diehard collector and you want the original, you can still get the PDF on Drive-Thru RPG. But if you just want to play the game, go ahead and get one of these. You can even get, if you want the cheapest option, you can go to Modiphius' website and get the PDF from them, and that's the cheapest way to do it. So those are the editions that's available. As I said, it's a game that is dependent upon scenarios. While you can make your own, obviously, it's a little more involved than just kind of creating a thing where random enemies show up. It's more involved than just what normally people would play solo tabletop RPGs, because all of your missions have goals to them and they have specific skill checks to make and things like that. So if you're really into writing your own scenarios, that's great. If you're not, after you've completed, like I said, the 17 that are in the basic book, so that should probably keep you playing quite a while, as you're probably not going to get through them more than one or two in an evening. But if you want more, I have written more, and I'll quickly run down that. I won't go too in depth. So this was the first one I did. So all of the supplements are available on DriveThruRPG, either as PDFs or print on demand. And this was the first one. This is Blood Moon, and this is like, I think it's $3.50 on DriveThru, and it's only one scenario, but it's one of my favorite ones that I've written. And in that one, basically, you or your rangers show up at this village, and you're immediately met by 4 what I call auxiliary companions. They're kind of the local militia, and they tell you the story about how the whole place got overrun by werewolves. And so you go in and check it out. But little do you know that one of those 4 companions actually is a werewolf as well. And as you go through the scenario, you start uncovering facts, and at some point, one of those companions will become a werewolf. And so it's got kind of an element of both action adventure in that you're going through this town and fighting other things, but also at some point, hopefully, you're going to find out the truth that one of your companions isn't what they seem. So that's the first one. And then I wrote one called Temple of Madness. And this is got 4 scenarios in it. And in this one, I really wanted to see what I could do. I wanted to see if I could play with the mechanics of notes. So like I said, some of the scenarios have notes in the same way that kind of choose your own adventures do. And so in this one, as you play the scenarios, in a bunch of the scenarios, you learn kind of numbers, or you find numbers, and you start having to put these numbers together in different ways to read specific notes. So in one scenario, you're trying to unlock a magic door, and it's got a code, and that code is 3 letters, and you start to, or 3 numbers, and you can find the different numbers in the room, but you don't know what order to put them in. So it becomes kind of this logic puzzle as you play, but of course you're trying to solve that logic puzzle while skeletons or whatever are attacking your figures. It's also got the scenario where you actually get to like swing across a board on chains, because I just thought that was cool. And yeah, so I kept going. Like I said, I won't go too deep into these. Just a quick one called Incinerator. I wrote this one for what happens if you ever fail a mission. So what if you have basically a total party kill, but you don't want to actually kill off your character? Then I wrote this one. This is 2 scenarios where basically you get captured and chucked in a death trap. And, because all evil loves to chuck heroes in death traps and give them a chance to survive. So that's what that is. And then you've got, what else have we got? Then we've got Ghost Stone. This is kind of a more classic, it's almost a Dirty Dozen type military operation down in the Shadow Deep. And the weird thing about that one is you actually have to have 2 different ranger parties. One that's kind of activating on the surface and kind of causing a distraction, while your other team is going in and taking out the big scary thing that's trying to kill everybody. One thing I should have mentioned back in Temple of Madness is Temple of Madness starts off a narrative line. So if you make it through Temple of Madness, you learn something really important at the end of that. And then I've picked that up with another one called Across the Wastes, where you start off through the desert and then down into the Shadow Deep. And that is the first part of a trilogy I'm working on. That's going to be one big mission to try to take advantage of that information you learn in Temple of Madness. Because it's a very narrative-driven game. and some of that narrative is created by me as the kind of game master, as it were. But a lot of it's left up to you as the player. You know, I don't define who your Rangers are and what their kind of personal motivations are, although they, you know, I give different kind of clues and such. And so really the game can be played either as a tactical war game, you know, I'm just here to roll the dice and try to defeat this, or you can play it as more of a role-playing game, and this is my character, and this is how he would act in the situation. And that tends to be more how I play war games anyway, and how I wanted this to be, so that, you know, it might be better to fire my bow here, but I see my ranger as the guy who's going to, you know, swing across that chain and go for it. So that's a very brief summary of the history and mechanics and such of Rangers of Shadow Deep, but I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions because I didn't get through them last time. And I'll try to go through the chat here, but if you also want to dump questions in the question and answer, that's probably actually easier for me to keep track of. So I'll just is there, or have you considered a single book release for the additional scenarios? I have. So I talked to Modiphius about it for a while, but the truth is I didn't really want to do it through them, and that's not a comment about them at all. I've been really happy with them as partners in this endeavor, but as a freelance writer, game designer, I wanted to keep open that kind of self-publishing part of what I do. So I am actually currently working on collecting the first 4 of the supplements into one book. So Ghost Stone, Temple of Madness, Blood Moon, and Incinerator all into one kind of thick book, you know, which won't change anything if you're just playing the PDFs. It'll just be one big PDF, and that's probably not even as good a way to do it. But if you're after the print editions, then yeah, it'll be a nicer, kind of easier book to put on your shelf. New expansion, Red King, is actually, the Red King is for Frostgrave. So my original war game, and it's a very narrative-driven campaign, but it's still a kind of player versus player thing. So if you are more into player versus player, then you definitely want to go Frostgrave, but it's still a very narrative game. Can I play without terrain pieces, or are they a necessary component to gameplay? Again, it depends on what you mean by that. It is certainly possible to play the game fully two-dimensionally. I know there are people that play it just with tokens, you know, on a mat and either draw in the terrain or use, you know, two-dimensional cards or paper to represent the terrain, and that's absolutely fine. Like I said, and even with the terrain itself, it's not about what usually that terrain is. It's more about its footprint on the table. The scenarios tend to be very much about movement and how far you move and where you get to during a game. So the terrain is more like blocking than it is kind of what it is important in the most case. So, are you going to make updates to Frostgrave for solo play, or is that aspect going to be more focused on Rangers? So I did write basically an entire book for Frostgrave devoted to solo play called Perilous Dark, which draws on a lot of my experiences from Rangers of Shadow Deep. And that's very much a book. While it's got Frostgrave scenarios in it, it's also got a lot of talk about just my philosophy of solo or cooperative gameplay. The problem with, it's not a problem. You can play perfectly fun and fine Frostgrave solo games, and it even has a very different flavor than Rangers does. But Frostgrave wasn't designed from the ground up to be a solo game, and thus it has limitations to it. So in terms of really doing a narrative solo game. I will stay concentrated on Rangers of Shadow Deep, but I can't kind of help but cross-pollinate these games because, when I have this really cool idea mechanically, and I think, wow, that really worked in Rangers. Can I work that into Frostgrave? So, yeah, I'll keep doing both. But Frostgrave is at its heart a player versus player game, and I never want to completely get away from that. But it's also more challenging in that the wizards in Frostgrave have a lot more variation of capability than Rangers do. So that in Frostgrave, a wizard could theoretically teleport every turn, and keeping track of or creating a scenario that ensures that the capability of being able to teleport every turn doesn't just break the scenario, becomes challenging when you have to multiply that over a number of spells. But anyway, it is something I'm still working on. As a self-publisher, how difficult was it to get your project out there to the public? That's a toughie. I mean, I had a big advantage I had two big advantages. One, I'd already done Frostgrave, so my name was known to a certain crowd. So I had a base to begin with. There were X number of people who just bought it because it was me. And the other advantage I had was that for many years preceding the publication of Rangers, I was a marketing person for Osprey Games. So I knew a lot about marketing. Not that there's a huge secret there, to be honest. Marketing these days is essentially make as much noise as possible on the internet about your game. And, obviously do that politely, but, you need to be on Facebook, and you need to be on Twitter, and you need to be on every other social media you can get on. The days of kind of the author or creator being separate from marketing are gone, unfortunately, perhaps, but you have to be a self-promoter, or at least a game promoter for your own game to get it there. So it's a challenge, but it's just one of the things you've got to go through. And hopefully the good news is if you can get enough people interested in your game, then it be kind of, it sets a ball rolling, and they become your marketing after a while. But the other thing is you got to do things like this, that are both fun, but they can be nerve-wracking, to have your face plastered in a video with lots of people watching you. But it's part of what being a game creator is these days. So, mechanics question. When doing a group activation, is the number of companions that can activate limited only to being with 3 inches? Okay, so that's a mechanic that comes from Frostgrave that originally I brought into Rangers of Shadow Deep, and that is the rule in the original self-published edition. Later, I realized there was absolutely no point to that rule in this game. It didn't accomplish what it accomplished in Frostgrave, and in fact, it became limiting, and it became extra limiting for a player who was playing solo as opposed to ones that were playing with multiple players. So that I dropped that rule for the current edition of the game, and now in fact, I modified the rule so that not only can you activate additional companions no matter where they are on the table, the number of companions you can activate decreases with the number of players. So if you're playing solo, you can activate your ranger and 3 companions anywhere on the table. If you're playing with 4 rangers, you can't activate any companions at the same time. Only the rangers can activate. Because another thing I learned between kind of putting out the original edition and then doing the later Modifius editions is that I hadn't gotten the balance completely right. And parties with 3 or 4 rangers were more powerful than parties with 1 or 2 rangers. And so I went back and inserted a challenge level in every scenario. So I've modified every scenario for a challenge level. And you can use that if you're playing with 3 or 4 players, or you can just use that if you want harder missions, because figuring out how hard a solo scenario should be is one of the biggest tricks as a game designer, because not, some people want scenarios that are going to nearly kill their party every time, and others want ones that are going to be challenging, but we're basically going to be all right. So, and I've tried to mix and match that level throughout the game. Some of the scenarios are meant to be more deadly, or at least more potentially deadly than others. How do you keep the surprise aspects of a story and mystery balanced with the need for players to craft and prepare the minis and the board to be used? A couple of different ways. And I will admit that can be really challenging. And it's one of my first things is like, well, how can I surprise them if I don't tell them what the figures they need? And the first way I get around that is whenever you start a mission, if it's this or one of the ones in the main book, there is a list at the beginning of all the figures you could potentially need for this mission. So you do upfront know, okay, these are the things I could possibly encounter. However, you don't know necessarily which scenarios will appear in, or how they will appear, or even if they will appear, because some of the scenarios it's much more obvious because you've got everything spelled out at the beginning of the scenario, place these on the table and these might show up. But others you do have hidden information, so it is possible that you're playing and suddenly an ogre springs out of nowhere. So you will know that you'll need an ogre ahead of time. You just have no idea when he's going to show up during the game. So as for boards, I don't really keep that secret. I do tell you in advance, this is what you're going to need. But what I don't always tell you is, so like especially in Burning Light, I'll say, this is how you set up the room, but now place 4 points of interest. Point of interest A here, point of interest B here, point of interest C here. And those are basically things you have to go and investigate and may change the situation, or you may find something. It won't change the terrain that's in a room, but it may change the whole situation going on. So, are the monsters from Frostgrave transferable to Rangers of Shadowdeep? Yep. It uses the exact same stat line across. That was always one of my goals. When I first started doing Rangers, part of what I wanted to do was allow people that already had a pretty good collection of Frostgrave figures to use a lot of those figures again. That said, so like kind of gnolls are the main bad guy troop for the Shadowdeep. But one man's gnoll is another man orc. So if you've got a bunch of orcs and want to use orcs instead, that's fine. But yeah, if you've got a bunch of Frostgrave monsters, a lot of them are going to be in Rangers of Shadowdeep anyway. But certainly, if you want to create your own scenarios, you can use stuff from Frostgrave. How did I build an audience for my games? Well, like I said, I did have the advantage of having a lot of game marketing experience. And, I went about making a lot of noise. The whole gaming community in the UK is very different than that based in the US. In the US, a lot of your gaming is kind of based around the store as your kind of central hub, whereas in the UK, it's based around gaming clubs. And these clubs can be quite big and quite interconnected. So it's a little easier to kind of, if you can get your game into a club, it spreads a little easier, I think, than it probably does in the US. But that said, a couple of things I did. Well, first I sent it to, in the UK, there's actually 3 wargaming magazines, so I sent it to all of them. Probably in the US, the most important thing I did was I sent it to Ash Barker at Guerrilla Miniature Games. And that is probably the main thing I would say to do now, is to approach YouTube video war game makers, game players and game talkers, and try to get them to talk about your game, because those are the people these days with kind of the biggest clout and the biggest potential to spread your game. But the other thing I suggest is, create a blog, and if you can, every day or every other day or as often as you can, write something that is related to your game. And even if that's just look at this new miniature I've painted for my game, then it's there, and then you can tweet about it, and then you can put it on Facebook, and so that every day you're saying something about your game, even if it's not direct. It's still getting that out there, and create a Facebook group for your game. In fact, that's probably the first thing I would do. I use a lot of different social media, but probably Facebook is not probably about it. Facebook is the most important for my game marketing at the time, because that's the Facebook group is now the easiest way for people to think. Somebody who hears about Rangers of Shadow Deep, well, I might be interested in that. They join the Facebook group, and all of a sudden they basically see all the fun that other people are having with this game. They get to see all the figures people are painting, and they're seeing all the games that people are playing, and it just gets people excited. So those are my quick answers to that question. Basically, you just keep talking it up every chance you get, every place you can find. Like I said, without being rude about it, but be a self-promoter. Is there any updated Scenario 2 table from the new book available for us Deluxe users? Yes. If you go on to Drive-Thru RPG and search for Rangers of Shadow Deep Rules Update, it's a free update. And what it actually is the changes in the rules to the Deluxe Edition from the original edition, but it's got the correct table in there that just didn't get printed in the Deluxe Edition. So the table for that is in there, and it's free. You can also find it on the Facebook group in the files section. So it's there and it's free. How has lockdown online play changed how you thought about game design, and what are people looking for? I do admit that from a professional point of view, I got lucky with lockdown. In no other way did it what I consider this lucky, but I did happen to put out a solo tabletop game pretty soon before lockdown happened, and all of a sudden solo became this huge thing. So that actually had a big effect, but it has changed my thinking in that I think, if possible now, all tabletop games should have a solo aspect to them. As a game designer, you should always think about, how are people going to play this solo? Because, we could end up in a situation like this, but also a lot of people just don't have someone to play with, but still want to play these games. So, as I talked about yesterday, I've got a new game called Stargrave coming out, which primarily is a player versus player game. But I've spent the last month really working on rules so that you can play it solo. Hopefully lockdown will be mostly over by the time the game comes out. But not only does this give a new aspect of the game, it means that if someone buys my game, they can immediately play it. That they don't have to have an opponent, and that both makes it more desirable for the end user, but also means that they are also more likely to then blog about it or go on the Facebook group and talk about it because they're actually playing. So it's, again, good for the marketing as well. But yeah, I think it's something that now should be thought about all the time. With the cross-pollination as you described, can we expect some bleed with these demons in Rangers of Shadow Deep? The ones from the Red King, I'm guessing. I don't know. I purposely avoid the question of whether Rangers of Shadow Deep and Frostgrave take place in the same world. Partly that's because the ownership of the games is slightly muddled, and that one's published by one company and one's published by another. But also because I want players to be free to make that decision for themselves. If it's cool to you that Frostgrave and the Shadow Deep are in the same world, then go for it, put them together. If not, don't worry about it, keep them separate. So, but I mean, again, like, if you don't want to use gnolls, you can use heavily armored demons as your Shadow Deep shock troops. So go for it. How hard is it to make your own scenarios for you and your friends? Does the book offer advice and guidance? No, it does not. And that's not because I purposely want to avoid that. It's because I haven't quite figured out a good way to do it. The scenarios in Rangers of Shadow Deep, for the most part, are very driven by the narrative. So without establishing a narrative first, it's very difficult for me to tell you how to go about making a scenario. I mean, I think if you play through the ones, just even in the basic book, you're going to have a pretty good idea of the components and what's necessary, and you'll be able to do it. And a lot of people, so if you are on the Facebook group, there's a huge file section, and a lot of people have made additional, fan content, free scenarios that you can try out. And some of them are really quite good. So I think just by playing it, you're going to learn a lot of these. But again, you're going to want to start with your narrative. And if that is something that interests you, then do jump on the Facebook group and just ask, and people will help you out and say, that's good, but have you thought about this and that? Is there an official fan community board where it shares images, maps, and such? The biggest one is the Facebook group. There's like 8,000, 7,000, 8,000 people in there, and there's all kinds of stuff in the file section, and there's loads and loads of posts showing how people have set up their tables. And like I said, some people are playing in 2D and some people are playing in 3D, and some people are using absolutely gorgeous terrain and other people are using blocks. So get in there and have a look. If you aren't Facebook and you don't like Facebook, you can get some of that on Board Game Geek. There's a decent little community there that's also doing stuff and a lot of images there as well. But I would suggest the Facebook group because it's a really nice group. One of the great things about solo and cooperative gaming is because it's not antagonistic. You're never playing against someone, so so you don't get the kind of like, that's a cheesy rules cheat. Well, of course it's not. And that's something actually I should have mentioned earlier, and I want to be very clear about, and I try to always be clear, is because it is a solo or co-op game, you have no opponent. No one's going to complain if you change the rules, so it's beautiful in the sense that, like, I know, like, I have no rules for fighting with two weapons. And I did that very specifically because I couldn't come up with a mechanical way that I thought really worked. But some people really want that mechanic in there. So there's been a lot of discussions on how to do that. And I think people have come up with some decent ways. So it's not a rule for the game, but it's a perfectly good house rule. And there's so much you can do with that. And there's just loads of discussions about that sort of stuff on the boards, which is a lot of fun. Can you give us a hint about what's coming up? Yeah, sorry, I meant to do that and totally forgot. So I have finished writing the manuscript for part 2 of what is called The Rescue. So it starts with Across the Waste, and the second one is called Dungeons Dark. And this is the first time that I have. This one is basically a dungeon crawl. It's got 4 scenarios, and each scenario is the level of a dungeon. So for this one, you do need to actually construct a map, and you can do that in 2D. And I give you some places you can go to get files to do that with well enough. But you're basically going to have to set up a dungeon on your table, and that one uses a lot of hidden information. So you know what to set up the table to look like, and you may know a few of the creatures wandering the halls, but you do not know what's in any of the rooms. So basically, whenever you start opening doors, you go and read the entry for the room, and it tells you what to put in there. And that one is a little more challenging kind of terrain-wise, but I've tried to keep the terrain in the rooms pretty generic. So if you got just some, crates and a few bits of furniture lying around, you'll be able to set up the rooms. That's not overly important, but again, you're going to find a lot of things, and you're going to see a lot of notes. So that one, more than anyone I've done before, probably mimics a classic RPG in the dungeon crawl sense anyway, and just kind of not knowing what's around the next corner and what's in the next room. But actually, it's not a dungeon crawl in the sense that you're just there to hack and loot. You're actually trying to get through this dungeon because you need to get out to the other side. So you have a big mission. But and then the third one is going to be called Tenebrous Citadel, and I don't want to talk too much about that because I don't want to give away kind of what's happened in the previous two. But essentially, that's going to be a bit more like Burning Light, where you're actually going into this giant enemy fortress and fighting your way through different rooms and through a big map. So that's what's going on there. That's everything, I think, in the questions. I'll take a quick look through the chat. But if you have another question, go ahead and throw it up. The chat's really jumping.
While you're looking at chat, I'm going to throw up the poll for just a second, just so everyone who didn't get a chance can vote.
Yep.
I'll do it for like a minute.
Okay. Any new official miniatures on the horizon? Yes, there are. I should have mentioned, yeah. So while it's a completely miniatures and agnostic game, use any miniatures you want, especially for your ranger and your companions. Go get your favorite Reaper figures and put them on the table. There is an official line of miniatures produced by North Star Military Figures in the UK. They're all sculpted by Bobby Jackson. And it's not a complete line, but it's got a lot of the kind of unique things in the game. And coming, I think sometime this month, we're getting a few more, and they're kind of specific to Across the Wastes. So you're getting the Humpback, who's a big ogre minotaur camel combination thing. It's one of the weirder. Normally, I keep my kind of monsters more generic so that you can use what miniatures you want. But occasionally, I have one that's very specific to the setting, so that's one of them. And also the zombie camel. I'm really looking forward to that figure because really, doesn't everybody need a zombie camel in your miniature collection? And then there's 2 auxiliary companions you pick up in that game. So at the start of the rescue, 2 guys join your party because they have specific roles to play. So you get to control the kind of new NPCs, and there's going to be figures for those 2 guys. But again, if you have ones you like, then go for it. See, someone says that their favorite part about Rangers is that it's objective based. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, when I wrote Frostgrave, a few people accused me of writing a war game in which you didn't actually have to fight anybody because it was about grabbing loot, and in theory you could just grab the loot and run off. But yeah, I mean, for me, like I said, I wanted to push this towards role-playing, and one of the keys to role-playing is that, well, I mean, obviously you can play role-playing as hack and slash, but role-playing has this infinite possibility of objectives, of things you're trying to accomplish, and I wanted to bring that into tabletop gaming. And yeah, I'm quite in my own player, I'm quite a white knight. I like to play paladin kind of things, and so Rangers of Shadow Deep is very much a kind of like we are fighting against the darkness, free peoples versus Mordor kind of setting. And but yeah, you're not like going out and just trying to slaughter their armies. You're usually trying to find information or rescue people or sabotage one specific weapon that they've got or something like that. So yeah. But I thought about releasing source books that talk more about the setting, like a series of missions set in a snow-covered landscape or another near a seacoast. I have, and I have come to no strong conclusion on it at the moment. When I've written Frostgrave and Ghost Archipelago, I very much have tried to keep settings somewhat generic. And I do that because I don't know what terrain collection you have. I don't want to force my vision of the world on you. and I think that's very right for Frostgrave and those kind of games. For Rangers, because it is narrative based and because it is set in a, and the missions take place in a very specific setting, and your actions can change things. I have been more inclined to do it, but I haven't yet. And part of the reason is I don't want to trap myself. I want to be free to create whatever I need for the next story I want to tell. And there's always a danger of over defining your setting, so that if I need a big city here, I need to be able to put it there. And if I've completely defined where all the big cities are, then I can't. So I don't know. We'll see. I'm in some of the books, there are kind of text boxes that give you more of the background or background about a specific thing. But I haven't done it too much. Desert Grave. Well, if you want desert, you can go across the way. So it's got 4 desert scenarios. Interestingly, when I very first started working on Frostgrave, I thought I was going to set it in the desert. Obviously, it wasn't called Frostgrave then, but I knew I wanted a dead city full of magic stuff. And I first thought, yeah, sand. And then somewhere along the line, I just switched it, I think, because, what's even more dead than dead and sandy? It's dead and cold. So, but I may get back to it. I've always avoided. I don't want to write just a new setting for a game that already exists. I want to always make sure that the gameplay experience is new. So when I came to write Ghost Archipelago, which is set in the same world as Frostgrave, I didn't want Frostgrave in the jungle. I wanted a different game in the jungle. So, there you have a different kind of protagonist, and it just gives you different decisions to make during the game. And so, and that was the same with Rangers. I mean, while it changed dramatically and then it became solo and co-op, it also, again, you have a different protagonist whose skill set is different and whose kind of special abilities operate differently, so that you're playing, again, a different game. I think we're just about out of time. I will, if you have any questions later, do jump onto the Discord. I don't know how long the Discord's remaining open, but if it's still around tomorrow morning, I will jump on there and try to answer any questions that you put up there, and that if I missed something, if I didn't answer it here, then I'll try to get there too. Oh, great to see somebody's.
You can also transfer over to the Reaper proper Discord as well. There's various text channels and stuff that exist there, and you can open up tables to talk to people and things like that as well.
Okay, great. See somebody saying they're playing with their kids. That is absolutely wonderful. I love that. That's probably the best kind of feedback I hear about my games is people playing it with their children. Maybe because my kids are just a little too young to play games yet, and so I'm jealous. But I love that that it's bringing families together and giving them something to play with, and taking me back to my own childhood, where my father was my first game master. So that's wonderful to hear. And well, thanks for everybody for showing up. This has been great, and it's been a great turnout. And yeah, so if you haven't tried it out, Rangers, go give it a look. And if you had, thanks for the support, and I'll try to keep making fun stuff for you.